The taxi ride from the airport was a blur of gray highway and gray sky. I sat in the back seat, my head resting against the cool, smudged glass of the window, still smelling the cloying scent of lilies and damp earth that clung to my black wool coat. I was 65 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt every single one of those years pressing down on my spine. I had just buried my older brother, Marcus. He was the last piece of my childhood. A Vietnam veteran who had survived the jungles only to be taken by a quiet, relentless battle with lung cancer. I had spent the last 2 weeks in Atlanta, sleeping in a vinyl chair beside his hospice bed, holding his hand as his breaths grew shallow. I was running on empty, physically depleted, emotionally hollowed out. All I wanted was my house. I wanted the familiar squeak of the third step on the staircase. I wanted to sink into my own armchair, brew a pot of chamomile tea, and mourn my brother in the quiet dignity of the home I had spent 30 years building. The taxi turned onto Elmwood Drive. I sat up slightly, fishing in my purse for the fare. "Here you go, ma'am," the driver said, pulling up to the curb. He threw the car into park, but he didn't immediately turn around. Instead, he stared out the windshield, his brow furrowing. "Ma'am, you sure this is the right address? Looks like they're having a yard sale, or an eviction." My hands froze inside my purse. I looked up, following his gaze. The breath was knocked out of my lungs, as surely as if someone had taken a baseball bat to my ribs. My house, the pale yellow 2-story colonial I had purchased after 3 decades of grinding 12-hour shifts as a surgical nurse, looked like a disaster zone. Scattered across the meticulously manicured front lawn, the grass I used to weed by hand on Sunday mornings, were cardboard boxes. Dozens of them. Some were neatly taped, but others were overflowing, their contents spilling out onto the damp earth. I handed the driver a $50 bill, didn't wait for the change, and practically stumbled out of the car. My knees felt like water. "Hey, watch your step," the driver called out, but I couldn't hear him over the roaring in my ears. I walked onto the grass. It had rained the night before, and the ground was soft. The toe of my leather pump bumped against something hard. I looked down. It was a stack of vinyl records. The sleeves were warped from the morning dew. John Coltrane, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, my late husband's prized jazz collection, the records he used to play in the kitchen while we danced after putting our kids to sleep. A few feet away, peeking out from beneath a crumpled garbage bag, was a wooden shadow box. The glass was cracked. Inside sat a purple heart, the metal Marcus had given me for safekeeping 20 years ago, because he trusted me more than anyone else in the world. My things, my entire life, my history, my memories, the tangible proof that Scarlett Hayes had lived, loved, and built a legacy, tossed onto the front lawn like yesterday's trash. "Oh, good, you're back." The voice sliced through the heavy, humid air like a serrated knife. I snapped my head up. Standing on the front porch was Danielle, my 29-year-old daughter-in-law. She was wearing a matching mint green Lululemon athletic set that hugged her perfectly flat stomach. Her hair was freshly braided, her edges laid flawlessly, and in her right hand, she held an iced matcha latte, condensation dripping down the plastic cup. She looked like she had just stepped out of an Instagram ad, glowing with a bizarre, manic energy. I couldn't speak. I stood there, a grieving woman in a wrinkled funeral dress, trembling amid the wreckage of my life. "I know it looks a little chaotic," Danielle continued, walking down the porch steps with a breezy, unbothered stride. She took a sip of her green drink. "But you know how it is. The nesting instinct just completely took over. I woke up yesterday and realized we absolutely needed to clear out the guest room. The baby's going to need a neutral, calming environment, and all this old stuff. It was just creating so much heavy, stagnant energy." I stared at her. My jaw was locked so tight my teeth ached. "Nesting instinct," I repeated, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "Yeah, the doctor said it's totally normal for the second trimester," she said, placing a manicured hand over her stomach, which showed absolutely no sign of a bump. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a cold, calculating curve of the lips. "Robert and I agreed that it was time to modernize. Your room is getting painted as we speak. Swiss coffee white. It's going to look so chic for the nursery." "My room," I said, he said. The words tasted like ash. "You emptied my bedroom while I was burying my brother." Danielle sighed, a heavy, exaggerated sound, rolling her eyes just a fraction. "Scarlett, please don't do that. Don't make this into a drama. Robert told you we needed the space. You're just one person. What do you need a master bedroom for anyway? Besides, we set up a really cozy spot for you out back. You're going to love it. It's very private." She turned and gestured toward the side gate that led to the backyard. I didn't move. I looked at the cracked glass of Marcus's shadow box. I looked at the arrogant posture of the young woman standing in the driveway of the house I owned. A cold, sharp clarity began to pierce through the fog of my grief. I had let them live here to help them save money for a down payment. I had given them space, cooked their dinners, and paid the property taxes. I had thought I was being a supportive mother. I picked up the shadow box, holding it tightly to my chest. The broken glass bit into my palm, but the physical pain grounded me. "Where is Robert?" I asked. My voice was no longer trembling. It had dropped an octave, settling into the firm, commanding tone I used to use when a trauma code was called in the ER. Danielle's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "He's at work. He's been picking up extra shifts, to support his growing family." She took another sip of her drink, waving her free hand toward the gate. "Come on, I'll show you your new room." I didn't say another word. I walked past her, my posture straight, my eyes fixed forward. I didn't let her see me cry. I would not give her that satisfaction. Danielle hadn't just moved me to a smaller room in the house. She had exiled me from the house entirely. She led me across the backyard to the old, detached utility shed. It was a structure my husband had built in the late 90s to store the lawnmower, bags of fertilizer, and old paint cans. It had concrete floors, exposed aluminum insulation on the ceiling, and a single small window that looked out toward the alleyway. When Danielle pushed the flimsy wooden door open, the smell hit me instantly, a mixture of mildew, old gasoline, and cheap floral air freshener she must have sprayed to mask the rot. "Ta-da!" Danielle said, leaning against the doorframe. Inside, the lawnmower was gone, but the oil stains on the concrete remained. Pushed against the far wall was a twin-sized folding cot with a thin, yellowing mattress. Beside it was a plastic lawn chair holding a single, cheap, battery-operated lantern. There was no closet, no heating vent, no bathroom, just 4 damp walls and a cot. "It's rustic, I know," Danielle said, entirely unapologetic. "But it has character. And Robert ran an extension cord from the garage so you can plug in your phone. We figured since you're retired, you don't really need a lot of space. You can use the guest bathroom in the main house, but just try to keep it quick, okay? The smell of certain soaps makes me horribly nauseous lately. Pregnancy nose is so crazy." I stood in the center of the shed. The temperature in here was at least 10 degrees colder than outside. The dampness seeped through my thin coat, settling deep into my bones. "Leave," I said. "Excuse me?" Danielle blinked, her faux sweetness slipping. "I said leave. Get out of my sight," she scoffed, crossing her arms. "You know, Scarlett, your hostility is really toxic. I'm trying to create a positive environment for my unborn child, and you're just projecting all this negative energy. It's no wonder Robert gets so stressed out dealing with you." She spun on her heel and marched back across the yard, the back door of my house slamming shut behind her with a sickening thud. I was alone. I set Marcus's shadow box gently onto the plastic chair. Then I sat down on the edge of the cot. The metal springs groaned under my weight. For a long time I just sat there, staring at the concrete floor. As a black woman in America, I had swallowed my pride in more boardrooms, doctors' lounges, and bank offices than I cared to count. I had been underestimated, spoken down to, and overlooked, but I had never, not once in my 65 years, been humiliated in my own home, by my own blood. I didn't unpack. There was nothing to unpack. Everything I owned was sitting on the wet grass out front. I waited. As the sun went down, the shed grew pitch black and freezing. I wrapped myself in my heavy wool coat and pulled my legs to my chest. I listened to the sounds of the neighborhood, dogs barking, cars pulling into driveways. At 9:30 p.m., I heard the familiar hum of Robert's Honda Accord pulling into the driveway. I heard the car door shut. I heard the front door open and close. I waited an hour. I wanted to see if he would come looking for me. I wanted to see if the boy I had carried for 9 months, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the boy whose college tuition I had worked double shifts to pay, would have the basic decency to check on his mother after she buried her brother. He didn't come. At 10:45 p.m., I stood up. My joints were stiff, my back aching from the cold. I walked across the dark yard and let myself into the kitchen through the back door. The house was warm, smelling of garlic and roasted chicken. The contrast to the shed was a physical blow. I walked quietly down the hallway. The light was on beneath the door of the master bedroom. My master bedroom. I raised my hand and knocked, 3 sharp raps. A moment later, the door creaked open. Robert stood there. He was 32 years old, but in that moment, in his oversized sweatpants and wrinkled t-shirt, he looked like a terrified teenager. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, and there were dark purple bags under his eyes. "Mom," he whispered, looking nervously over his shoulder into the room. "You're back." "Step out into the hall, Robert," he said. My voice was deadly calm. He slipped out, pulling the door almost completely shut behind him. He rubbed his face, avoiding my eyes. "Mom, look, I know you're upset about the room." "The room?" I interrupted, my voice a low, steady hiss. "Robert, my belongings are rotting on the front lawn. My brother's Purple Heart was lying in the mud. You put me in a utility shed that smells like gasoline." "It's temporary," he pleaded, keeping his voice down. He looked at me, and I saw the desperation in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a malicious man. It was the look of a trapped animal. "Mom, you don't understand how hard it's been. Danielle she's having a really difficult pregnancy. Her blood pressure is all over the place. The doctor said any spike in cortisol could cause a miscarriage." I narrowed my eyes. "I spent 30 years in nursing, Robert. Do not quote medical jargon to me to justify treating me like an animal." "I'm not!" He ran a hand over his short haircut, looking frantic. "She was just nesting. She got manic, Mom. She started boxing things up and dragging them out while I was at work. When I got home, she was crying, saying the house was too crowded, that she couldn't breathe, that she was failing as a mother before the baby was even born. What was I supposed to do? Yell at her? Risk the baby? You were supposed to pick up my things," I said, every word a stone. "You were supposed to act like the man I raised you to be." Robert flinched. He looked down at his feet. "She said you'd understand. She said you'd want the baby to have the best start. Mom, please, just give me some time to talk her down. She's my wife. She's carrying my child. She has to be my priority right now." I looked at my son. I looked at the way he cowered in the hallway of the house I bought, terrified of waking the woman who had commandeered my life. I saw the trauma bond clearly, the way Danielle manufactured crises, threatened the safety of the unborn child, and forced Robert to constantly walk on eggshells, compromising his own morals to keep the peace. He wasn't ignorant. He was broken. But his brokenness was no excuse for my abuse. "You sleep well, Robert," I said quietly. "Mom," I turned my back on him and walked out the back door, returning to the freezing shed. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Not because of the cold, but because the fog of grief had completely lifted, replaced by a burning, terrifying clarity. If Robert was too weak to protect our family, I would have to do it myself. By 3 a.m., the temperature in the shed had dropped to 40 degrees. I was shivering, wrapped in my coat, staring at the glowing screen of my iPad. Danielle's claim that Robert was picking up extra shifts to support the growing family kept echoing in my head. Robert was a senior software engineer. He made a low 6-figure salary. They had no mortgage to pay because I let them live here rent-free. They only paid for utilities and groceries. Why on earth would he need to pick up extra freelance shifts? Where was his money going? During my years as a head charge nurse, managing department budgets was half my job. I knew how to track inventory, I knew how to balance ledgers, and I knew when numbers didn't add up. When I retired, I had downsized my life. I had a primary checking account for my pension and Social Security, but I also had a high-yield emergency savings account. It contained $60,000, the payout from my late husband's life insurance and my own hard-earned savings. It was my safety net for medical emergencies or assisted living, should I ever need it. When Robert and Danielle got married, I had done something foolish. I had acted out of love, not logic. I had gone to the bank and added Robert's name as a joint account holder on that emergency fund. I told him, "This is only for an absolute catastrophe. If something happens to me, or if you ever face a life or death emergency, you don't have to wait for probate to access funds." I hadn't looked at that account in 8 months. I hadn't needed to. My fingers were stiff from the cold as I tapped the banking app icon on my iPad. I entered my password. The loading circle spun, illuminating the dark, damp shed with a sterile blue light. The screen populated. My primary checking, $4,200. Normal. My retirement, IRA, untouched. Normal. The joint emergency savings, $1,450. I stopped breathing. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, thinking the cold was blurring my vision. I looked again. $1,450. $58,550 were gone. A wave of nausea washed over me. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. $58,000. It wasn't just money. It was the physical manifestation of my sweat, my missed holidays, the double shifts where my feet bled in my shoes. It was my independence. Did someone steal my identity? Did the bank make an error? My clinical training kicked in. Panic helps no one. Data solves problems. I clicked on the account to view the transaction history, filtering it back to the last 8 months. I expected to see a trail of thousands of small transactions. I expected to see Amazon hauls, Sephora charges, designer maternity clothes, or luxury vacations, the typical footprints of a shopaholic. But the ledger wasn't cluttered. It was stark, brutally simple. There were no shopping sprees. The money had not bled out from 1,000 paper cuts. It had been severed in 2 massive, violent blows. October 12th. Wire transfer out, $32,000. Payee, Apex Asset Recovery and Collections. January 4th. Wire transfer out, $26,550. Payee, Midwest Lien Resolutions, LLC. I stared at the screen, the cold of the shed completely forgotten, replaced by a heat that radiated from the core of my stomach. I didn't know much about high-level finance, but I knew what those company names meant. Apex Asset Recovery wasn't a credit card company. They were the people who bought defaulted, toxic debt. They were the bottom feeders who garnished wages and seized property. And Midwest Lien Resolutions? You don't pay a lien resolution company unless someone is actively trying to put a lien on an asset. An asset like a house. My house. I opened a new tab on Safari and typed in Midwest Lien Resolutions. I navigated to their FAQ page. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until I found the section on property liens. If an individual resides at a property and utilizes it as their primary address for significant lines of credit, creditors may attempt to place a judgment lien on the property in the event of severe default, pending proof of ownership. Robert didn't own the house, but Robert and Danielle's legal address was here. If Danielle had defaulted on massive secret debts, the creditors would have come knocking at this address. They would have threatened to attach the debt to the property. Robert knew the house was in my name. He knew a lien would involve me, alert me, and drag me into court. To protect his pregnant wife from going to jail for fraud and to hide the catastrophe from me, he had used my own emergency fund to pay off the debt collectors before they could file the paperwork. He hadn't just been a coward in the hallway tonight. He was an accomplice to financial ruin. Danielle wasn't just a spoiled hormonal daughter-in-law throwing a tantrum over wanting a bigger bedroom. That was a facade, an act. She was drowning in toxic debt, and she had used my son as a shield and my life savings as a life raft. And now she was systematically trying to erase me from the property, throwing my things on the lawn, pushing me into the shed, to establish full dominance over the only asset she had left to exploit. I locked the iPad screen. The shed plunged back into total darkness. I sat in the dark, listening to my own breathing. The grief I felt for my brother was still there, but it was now encased in armor. The tears I had wanted to shed for Marcus, for my husband, for the son I thought I knew, dried up completely. They thought I was just an old, tired black woman who would keep her head down, accept the shed, and quietly fade away to keep the peace. They thought because I was quiet, I was weak. They had forgotten that before I was an old woman, I was a charge nurse in the trauma ward of Southside Chicago. I spent my life pulling people back from the brink of death. I knew how to stop the bleeding, and I knew how to cut off a dead limb to save the body. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I didn't care that it was 4 a.m. I dialed the number for Chicago. It rang 3 times. "Mom?" The voice on the other end was groggy, but immediately alert. "Marianne." "My daughter," the corporate litigator. "Marianne," I said. My voice was steady, hard, and devoid of any maternal softness. "Wake up. Go make a pot of coffee and get your notepad." "Mom? What's wrong? Are you okay? Is it Uncle Marcus's funeral?" "Marcus is buried," I interrupted. "I need you to run a background check on your sister-in-law. Not a standard one. I need you to pull credit reports, civil court records, and judgment liens." Silence on the line for a second. Then the sound of bed sheets rustling. Marianne's voice shifted, the sleepy daughter vanishing, replaced by the shark in a tailored suit. "Give me 30 minutes. What exactly are we looking for, Mom?" I looked at the thin sliver of moonlight filtering through the dirty glass of the shed window. "We are looking for the truth," I said. "Because tomorrow morning, we are going to war." The sun did not rise with a brilliant dawn. It bled through the dirty glass of the utility shed in a dull, bruised gray. I hadn't slept a single minute. I sat on the edge of the folding cot, still wrapped in my wool coat, watching the dust motes dance in the weak light. At exactly 7:15 a.m., my phone buzzed in my lap. It was Marianne. "I have it," she said. Her voice was clipped, lacking any of its usual morning warmth. It was the voice she used when she was reviewing a hostile merger. "And Mom, it's worse than we thought." "Read it to me," I said, my voice raspy from the cold. I heard the shuffling of papers on her end. Danielle Hayes, Danielle Vance before she married Robert, doesn't just have bad credit. She has a radioactive financial footprint. 2 civil judgments against her in the state of Ohio from 3 years ago. She maxed out lines of credit, defaulted, and dodged the summons. But that's not the worst part. I closed my eyes. "Go on." "She has a history of identity fraud, Mom. Minor leagues mostly, but documented. She opened a credit card in a former roommate's name when she was 24. The roommate dropped the charges in exchange for her moving out immediately. She targets people with good credit, attaches herself like a parasite, and drains them. Robert wasn't just a romantic choice. He was a mark. He had 0 debt, a high income, and most importantly, he had a house. A house he doesn't own, I corrected quietly. "Exactly," Marianne said. "Which brings us to the wire transfers you found. I ran the name of that lien resolution company. If a creditor discovers a debtor is residing at a property, they can petition the court to place a judgment lien on it. It's a complex legal maneuver, but it's a scare tactic that works." Robert must have panicked. He used your money to pay off the sharks before they could file the paperwork and drag the actual homeowner, you, into a deposition. A bitter taste flooded the back of my throat. He knew Marianne. He knew she was drowning in debt, and he chose to steal my retirement rather than face me. "He's in a trauma bond, Mom. He's being emotionally held hostage," Marianne said softly, stepping out of her lawyer persona for a brief second to be a daughter. "But that doesn't excuse the theft. So here is what we are going to do. I have already drafted a revocation of tenancy. Legally, Robert and Danielle are tenants at will. They have no lease. I'm overnighting the documents to you. Second, you need to log into your portal right now. Transfer the remaining $1,400 to a brand new account in your name only. Remove his access to everything. Lock it down." "Done," I said. "Third," Marianne continued, her tone hardening again. "Do not confront them screaming. Let Danielle think she's winning. You have the ultimate trump card. You own the soil they are standing on." "I spent 30 years in an emergency room, Marianne," I replied, standing up. My joints popped in the freezing shed. "I know how to handle a hemorrhaging patient. You apply pressure and you don't let up." "I'm booking a flight," she said. "I'll be there tomorrow." I hung up the phone. I did the mobile transfers, watching the joint account balance drop to 0. Then I stood up and smoothed out my wrinkled dress. I walked out of the shed, across the frosted grass, and into the house. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight into my bathroom. I locked the door, turned the shower to scalding hot, and let the water wash the smell of the damp shed off my skin. I washed my hair. I lotioned my skin. I put on a tailored navy blue pantsuit, a strand of pearls my husband had given me for our 20th anniversary, and my favorite red lipstick. It was the armor of a black matriarch. I was not a victim to be pitied. I was the master of this house. At 6 p.m., the house smelled of rosemary, roasted chicken, and fresh yeast rolls. It was a domestic illusion so potent it almost made me sick. I had spent the day in a coffee shop downtown, printing documents at a nearby FedEx, organizing my papers in a leather portfolio. When I finally unlocked the front door and walked into the dining room, I saw that Danielle had set the table with my fine china, the china she had claimed was stagnant energy just 24 hours ago. But it wasn't just Robert and Danielle sitting at the table. Sitting at the head of the table, his hands folded peacefully over his stomach, was Reverend Thomas. He was the pastor of our community church, a man I had known for 2 decades. Danielle stood up, wearing a modest, flowing maternity dress, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. She looked the picture of the overwhelmed, grieving, but faithful daughter-in-law. "Scarlett, please," Reverend Thomas said, his voice deep and soothing. "Come sit. Danielle invited me over. We know you're going through a terrible time with Marcus's passing. Grief can make us act in uncharacteristic ways." I stood in the doorway, my leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I looked at Robert. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at his plate, his face pale, his jaw ticking. An intervention. Danielle had brought my pastor into my home to weaponize my own faith and community against me. She was trying to paint me as an unstable, grieving widow who needed to be managed, perhaps even institutionalized, to legitimize her taking over the house. "Uncharacteristic ways, Reverend?" I asked, my voice polite, even, and terrifyingly calm. I walked to the table, but I did not sit. "Danielle tells me you've been very agitated," the Reverend continued, his brow furrowing with genuine pastoral concern, "that you refused to sleep in the house last night. Scarlett, sister, there is no shame in needing professional help. There's a wonderful luxury-assisted living community in the next county. We just want what's best for you and for this new baby." "Is that what she told you?" I asked. I turned my gaze to Danielle. She met my eyes, a flicker of smug triumph dancing in her pupils. She thought she had outmaneuvered me. I placed my leather portfolio on the mahogany dining table. I unzipped it slowly. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "Let me tell you what is actually happening in this house, Reverend Thomas," I said, my voice echoing off the walls. I pulled out a stack of papers and slid them across the polished wood, right into the center of the table. "What is this?" Robert asked, finally looking up, his voice cracking. That, I said, pointing a manicured finger at the top page, is the property deed for 247 Elmwood Drive. You will notice it bears one name, Scarlett Hayes, not Robert Hayes, not Danielle Hayes. I own every brick, every shingle, and every blade of grass on this property. You are here by my grace, a grace that you have severely abused." The Reverend put on his reading glasses, glancing down at the official county seal. Danielle's smug expression faltered. I pulled out the next stack of papers, the bank statements. I dropped them in front of Robert. "And those," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "are the wire transfer receipts from the emergency savings account you drained behind my back. $58,000, Robert, wired to Apex Asset Recovery and Midwest Lien Resolutions." The silence in the dining room was absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Danielle turned paper white. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What did you give her? How did she get those?" "I didn't give her anything," Robert stammered, staring at the bank statements as if they were venomous snakes. "I am an ex-charge nurse, Danielle. I know how to read a chart and I know how to track a deficit," I said, turning my full attention to her. "You are drowning in debt from civil judgments you acquired before you ever put a ring on my son's finger. You brought toxic debt into my home, and you used my son to steal my retirement to cover your tracks." Reverend Thomas took his glasses off, his face a mask of shock. "Robert, is this true? Did you steal from your mother?" Robert looked like he was suffocating. He tugged at his collar, his eyes darting wildly between me, his wife, and the pastor. "Mom, please. We shouldn't do this here, not in front of the Reverend. You brought the Reverend into my home to call me crazy." I slammed my hand down on the table, the sharp crack making everyone flinch. The china rattled. "You sat there while this woman tried to convince my pastor to lock me away in a home so you could steal my house. You don't get to demand privacy now, Robert." I pulled out the final document. The notice of eviction. "I am giving you both 30 days to vacate my property," I stated, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "Furthermore, you will sign a legally binding agreement to repay the $58,000 with interest, or I will hand these wire transfers over to the police and press charges for elder financial abuse." "You can't do that!" Danielle shrieked, her demure facade completely shattering. She stood up, knocking her chair backward. "We are married! It's marital money! We are having a baby!" "It is my money, in an account bearing my name," I replied coldly. "And you are nothing but a tenant who has outstayed her welcome. Pack your bags." "Mom, wait, stop!" Robert surged to his feet, grabbing my arm. His grip was tight, desperate. I looked down at his hand, then up at his face. He was crying, real ragged tears streaming down his face. "Take your hand off me," I warned. He let go, backing up a step, holding his hands up in surrender. "Mom, please. You don't understand. I had to do it. I had to." "You had to steal my life savings?" "They were going to take her to jail," Robert shouted, his voice breaking, the ugly truth finally bursting out of him. "The collections agency tracked her here. They threatened to involve the police for wire fraud because she lied on credit applications. She told me if she went to jail, she'd kill herself. She said she couldn't have our baby in a prison cell." I stared at him, horrified, not by the debt, but by the profound depth of his psychological captivity. "Robert," I said softly, recognizing the classic signs of emotional extortion. "Creditors don't put you in jail for civil debt. That's illegal. She lied to you. She manipulated you to get my money." "No!" Danielle screamed, stepping around the table, her face twisted in rage. "Don't listen to her, Bobby. She's trying to poison you against me. She's always hated me because I took you away from her." "You didn't take him away from me," I said, my voice tired but unyielding. "You turned him into a thief. I want you out of this house. Tonight. You can go to a hotel. You can go to a shelter. I don't care. Get out." Reverend Thomas stood up slowly. I think it is best I leave you all to settle this family matter," he murmured, his face deeply troubled. He looked at Robert with profound disappointment before showing himself out the front door. As the door clicked shut, the air in the room shifted. Danielle realized she had lost the audience. She had lost the narrative. I had the deed, I had the bank statements, and I had the eviction notice. She looked at the paperwork, then at Robert, and then at me. Her eyes went completely dark, calculating. Suddenly, she gasped. It was a sharp, dramatic intake of air. She grabbed her stomach, her knees buckling. She fell heavily against the mahogany dining table, knocking over a crystal water glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor. "Ah, oh my God, Bobby!" she wailed, her voice a piercing shriek of pure agony. Robert was by her side in a millisecond, dropping to his knees. Danny, what is it? What's wrong?" "The baby!" she screamed, clutching her belly, her face contorted in pain. "It's cramps. Horrible cramps. Bobby, I think I'm bleeding." She wasn't bleeding. I was a nurse for 3 decades. I knew the signs of a genuine obstetric emergency. Her skin wasn't clammy. Her breathing wasn't shallow. She was putting on a theatrical performance of pain, a desperate final play to regain control of Robert and paint me as the villain. "Call 911, Robert yelled, looking up at me frantically. "Mom, call an ambulance." "She's faking, Robert," I said, my voice deadpan. "Tell her to stand up." "Are you insane?" Robert roared, his face turning purple with rage. The trauma bond snapped fully into place, overriding any logic or respect he had for me. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "Look what you did. Look at her. You couldn't just leave it alone. If she loses this baby, it is on you, you hear me? You killed my child over money." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. You killed my child. My own son. The boy I had protected from the world. The boy I had sacrificed my youth for, was looking at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, blaming me for a tragedy manufactured by a con artist. The injustice of it was so vast, so heavy, that my body simply couldn't process it. It started in my chest. Not a sharp pain, but a deep, crushing pressure, as if an invisible, iron-cast elephant had suddenly sat directly on my sternum. The breath left my lungs in a short, ragged gasp. "Robert," I tried to say, but my voice was gone. "Don't talk to me," he yelled, pulling his phone from his pocket to dial 911, entirely focused on his weeping wife. The pressure in my chest radiated outward, shooting down my left arm in a wave of numb, prickling ice. My jaw locked tight with a sudden, searing ache. The room began to spin, the edges of my vision darkening into a tunnel of gray static. As a medical professional, my brain clinically diagnosed what was happening to my own body. Myocardial infarction. Stress-induced. Acute. My knees gave way. I didn't fall gracefully. I collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, my shoulder slamming hard against the edge of the dining table before I hit the hardwood floor, right beside the shattered pieces of the crystal glass. The last thing I heard before the world went completely black was the sound of Danielle's fake sobbing, drowning out the silence of my failing heart. I woke up to the smell of iodine, bleach, and the faint, starchy scent of hospital linens. Before I even opened my eyes, my clinical training booted up, analyzing the data my body was receiving. The mattress was an air-fluidized bed, designed to prevent pressure ulcers. There was a nasal cannula delivering cool oxygen to my nostrils. Beneath my hospital gown, adhesive electrodes pulled at my skin, connected to a telemetry monitor that was beeping with a steady rhythmic blip 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 at around 72 beats per minute. I had survived. I fluttered my eyes open. The fluorescent lights overhead were dimmed. Sitting in the awful vinyl recliner in the corner of the room was my youngest son, George. He was 35, an architect living in Austin, Texas. He was asleep, his long legs stretched out, his jaw covered in dark stubble that suggested he had caught the first red-eye flight out. Sitting by the window, bathed in the blue light of her laptop screen, was Mary Ann. She was wearing the same tailored suit from the day before, though it was now hopelessly wrinkled. She was typing furiously, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "Mary Ann," I croaked. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. Her head snapped up. In an instant, the laptop was shoved aside, and she was at my bedside, pressing the call button for the nurse. George jolted awake, blinking rapidly before rushing over to grab my hand. "Mom, hey, you're awake," George whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. He kissed my knuckles. His hand was warm, so unlike the freezing dampness of the shed. "What were my troponin levels?" I asked. It was the first thing out of my mouth. Troponin is a protein released into the blood when the heart muscle is damaged. It's the definitive marker of a myocardial infarction. Mary Ann let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "Leave it to you to wake up and demand lab results. They peaked at 0.8, Mom. It was a mild heart attack, a NSTEMI. They didn't have to put a stent in, but the cardiologist said your blood pressure was terrifyingly high when the paramedics brought you in." A nurse bustled in, checking my vitals, asking me standard neurological questions to ensure I hadn't suffered any hypoxia. Once she was satisfied and left the room, the silence settled heavily over us. I looked at the door. I looked back at Mary Ann. "Where is Robert?" I asked. I didn't ask it with hope. I asked it to collect data. George's jaw clenched so hard I could hear his teeth grind. He looked away, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. Mary Ann sighed, pulling up a chair. "He's in the building, Mom, 4 floors up, in the maternity ward." I closed my eyes. The memory of the dining room rushed back. The shouting, the shattered glass, Danielle clutching her stomach, screaming that she was bleeding. "Did she lose the baby?" I asked. Despite everything, despite the theft and the humiliation, I would not wish a miscarriage on my worst enemy. I had seen enough women leave the hospital with empty arms to know that specific brand of hell. "No," Mary Ann said. Her tone was flat, devoid of any sympathy. "Because there was no emergency. The ER docs checked her out when Robert brought her in hysterical. No bleeding. Vital signs completely normal. Fetal heartbeat. Well, they couldn't find one on the Doppler because she's supposedly only in her first trimester, but her HCG blood work came back consistent with early pregnancy. They put her on bed rest for threatened miscarriage, due to stress. Robert hasn't left her side. He didn't even come down to the cardiac ICU when they were stabilizing you, Mom," George said, turning back around, his eyes blazing with a fury I rarely saw in my gentle youngest son. "I called him from the airport. I told him you almost died. He told me he couldn't leave Danielle because she was having a panic attack about losing the baby. He blamed you, Mom. He said you pushed her too far." The iron elephant returned to sit on my chest, but this time it wasn't a cardiac event. It was grief. The profound, hollow grief of a mother realizing her child is lost in a psychological cult of 2. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay?" George repeated, incredulous. "Mom, He chose a manipulative psychopath over you while you were having a heart attack on his dining room floor. I said okay, George, I repeated, my voice gaining strength. I looked at both of my children. In trauma nursing, triage is everything. You treat the salvageable limbs, and you amputate what is necrotic to save the body. Robert's mind is currently necrotic. He is infected by her. We cannot save him right now, so we save me. Marianne smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. The shark was back. Exactly, Marianne said. Which brings us to your discharge plan. The cardiologist wrote orders for zero-stress recovery. You are not going back to Elmwood Drive, not to the house, and sure as hell, not to that shed. I rented a furnished ground-floor apartment in Oak Park for the next 3 months. It has a courtyard, good security, and it's quiet. George and I moved your essentials in this morning. Who is paying for that? I asked, my financial anxiety spiking. I am, Marianne said firmly. Consider it my retainer fee, because while you are recovering, I am going to legally and financially dismantle Danielle Hayes. I looked at the ceiling tiles. I was 65. I had no house to return to, my emergency funds were drained, and my eldest son hated me. I had hit rock bottom. But rock bottom is a solid foundation. You can build on it. All right, I said. Where do we start? A week later, the smell of iodine had faded, replaced by the scent of fresh Colombian coffee and the subtle vanilla of a soy candle. My new apartment in Oak Park was small but immaculate. It had large windows that let in the afternoon sun, a plush beige sofa, and most importantly, absolute silence. No slamming doors. No passive-aggressive comments about stagnant energy. No fear. I was sitting at the small breakfast nook, checking my blood pressure on a home cuff. 120/80, perfect. When there was a sharp knock at the door, I checked the peephole and opened it. Marianne stood there, wearing a beige trench coat, holding a thick manila folder that looked like it weighed 5 pounds. She didn't say hello. She just walked past me, dropped the folder on the kitchen island with a heavy thwack, and turned to face me. I hired a private investigator, she announced, taking off her coat. A guy named Miller, ex-Chicago PD, specialized in financial crimes and fraud. He's expensive, and he's ruthless. I poured her a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. What did he find? Well, first he did what we call a trash pull, Marianne explained, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. In the state of Illinois, once garbage is placed on the public curb for collection, it is considered abandoned property. No warrant needed. Since Danielle is in her manic nesting phase, she threw out 3 heavy-duty black bags of junk on Tuesday. I frowned. She threw away an iPhone? An old iPad, Marianne corrected, her eyes gleaming. The screen was completely shattered, and it was bent in half. She probably took a hammer to it, thinking that destroyed the data. But Danielle is a scammer mom, not an IT professional. She didn't puncture the logic board, and more importantly, she never unsynced her iCloud account. Marianne opened the manila folder. The first thing she pulled out was a glossy, printed photograph of an electronic receipt. Miller's tech guy cloned the hard drive, she said, tapping the paper. Look at the date on this receipt. 2 months ago, right around the time she told Robert she was pregnant. I picked up the paper, putting on my reading glasses. It was a receipt from an Etsy store called Gag Gifts Galore. Item: hyper-realistic prank positive pregnancy test. Always shows 2 lines. Quantity 3 shipped to Danielle Vance, P.O. Box 409, Chicago, IL. I stared at the paper. My brain, wired for decades to trust medical reality, struggled to compute the sheer audacious sociopathy of it. She bought fake pregnancy tests. She mailed them to a P.O. box so Robert wouldn't see the package. Keep going, Marianne said, sliding a second stack of papers toward me. These were printed logs of Google search history, time-stamped late at night when Robert would have been asleep. 11:42 p.m. How to fake morning sickness without vomiting. 12:05 a.m. Symptoms of first trimester pregnancy to tell husband. 1:15 a.m. 8-week ultrasound pictures, no watermark download. 2:30 a.m. How to induce light bleeding to fake a miscarriage scare. A cold chill washed down my spine. The memory of Danielle collapsing against the dining room table, clutching her stomach, screaming in agony. It hadn't been a panic attack. It had been a calculated, rehearsed performance, researched at 2 a.m, executed perfectly to shift the blame onto me and manipulate Robert into a protective frenzy. My God, I whispered. She isn't pregnant. She never was. It gets worse, Marianne said softly. Her lawyer persona dropped for a second, revealing genuine disgust. She pulled out the final document from the folder. It looked different from the others. It was an official medical document bearing the letterhead of a women's clinic in Columbus, Ohio. The date was 5 years old. When Miller cracked her iCloud, he found an old folder labeled Taxes 2021, but it wasn't tax documents. It was medical records she had scanned and saved for an insurance claim years ago. I took the paper. My eyes immediately scanned past the administrative data to the attending physician's notes and the post-operative report. The medical jargon was dense, but to me, it read like a children's book. Patient, Danielle Vance, age 24, diagnosis, stage 4, endometriosis with severe uterine adenomyosis. Procedure performed. Total laparoscopic hysterectomy, TLH, with bilateral salpingectomy. The paper trembled in my hands. I read the line again. Total laparoscopic hysterectomy, the surgical removal of the uterus and fallopian tubes. She doesn't have a uterus, I stated, the words sounding hollow, alien in the quiet apartment. It is biologically, anatomically impossible for her to be pregnant. She's been lying to him from the day they met, Marianne said, her voice hard. She saw a guy who wanted a family, a guy with a good salary and a house, and she spun a web. When her creditors found her and threatened to ruin her, she faked the pregnancy to lock Robert down emotionally. She knew he wouldn't let the mother of his child go to jail or face ruin. He would do whatever it took to protect her. I set the paper down on the granite counter. I thought about Robert. I thought about the dark bags under his eyes, the frantic desperation in his voice when he said, "I can't have our baby born in a prison cell." I thought about how he had sacrificed his relationship with his mother, compromised his own morals, and stolen my retirement fund, all to protect a phantom child that never existed, cultivated by a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an ATM and a human shield. He had betrayed me, yes, but the psychological torture he was being subjected to was monstrous. "He's going to break," I said quietly. "When he finds out, it's going to destroy him." "He needs to be destroyed," Marianne replied, devoid of pity. "You have to tear down a condemned building before you can build a new one. He chose to throw you to the wolves, Mom. Now he has to realize he's been sleeping next to the alpha." I looked at my daughter. She was fierce, brilliant, and protective. But she wasn't a mother. She didn't know that even when your child stabs you in the back, your first instinct is still to check if their hand is bleeding from the handle. "What's the play?" I asked, pushing the empathy down into a locked box in my mind. "Danielle filed a request for a temporary restraining order against you yesterday," Marianne said casually, taking a sip of her coffee. My head snapped up. "What?" "She claimed to the police that your violent outburst at the dinner table caused her to suffer a threatened miscarriage. She's trying to build a legal paper trail to keep you off the Elmwood property permanently, ensuring the eviction notice is stalled in family court. She thinks she's playing 4D chess." I felt the familiar heat of anger rising in my chest, but I controlled it. I focused on the steady beating of my heart. "Let her," I said. Marianne raised an eyebrow. "Let her? If she files a false police report, that's perjury. If she takes it to a judge, that's contempt of court," I said, a cold surgical precision entering my voice. I tapped the medical records on the counter. "We aren't going to call Robert and show him this. He wouldn't believe us. He'd think we forged it. He's too deep in the trauma bond." "So how do we break it?" Marianne asked, leaning forward, realizing I was formulating a triage plan. "We don't break it," I said, picking up the glossy photo of the fake pregnancy test receipt. "We let her do it. We let her build her lie so high, so public, and so legally binding that when we pull the ultimate pin, the resulting explosion leaves her with absolutely nowhere to hide. Call Detective Miller. I need a few more things before we invite Robert and Danielle to a little family reunion." For 2 weeks, I lived in absolute silence. I drank my chamomile tea in the mornings, walked the perimeter of the Oak Park courtyard to rebuild my cardiovascular strength, and waited. In trauma care, there is a concept called the golden hour. It is the critical window of time following a severe injury when rapid medical intervention has the highest chance of preventing death. But in the legal and psychological war I was currently fighting, the principle was reversed. I didn't want to intervene rapidly. I wanted the infection to spread. I wanted Danielle's paranoia to fester until she made a fatal, unforced error. Robert had been asking questions. According to the private investigator, Miller, who had been tracking Robert's movements, my son had tried to schedule 3 different ultrasound appointments. Danielle had canceled every single one of them, citing extreme anxiety, a new doctor she preferred, or sudden mysterious bouts of nausea that kept her bedridden. The walls of her lie were closing in. The 30-day eviction notice was ticking down like a metronome. She needed a nuclear option to secure the house and permanently eliminate me from the equation. She chose the nuclear option on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my armchair, reading a novel, when the heavy, authoritative knock came at my apartment door. It wasn't the polite tap of a delivery driver. It was the hard, rhythmic pounding of law enforcement. I set my book down. My heart rate elevated slightly, but I took a deep, controlled breath, pushing the beta blockers to do their job. I walked to the door and checked the peephole. 2 uniformed police officers and a plainclothes detective stood in the hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Scarlet Hayes?" the detective asked. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weary face and a damp trench coat. "Yes. How can I help you, detective?" I asked, my voice steady, my hands folded neatly in front of me. "Ma'am, I need you to step out into the hallway and turn around. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of aggravated battery, breaking and entering, and reckless endangerment of an unborn child." The words hung in the humid air of the hallway. If I hadn't spent the last 2 weeks preparing for exactly this kind of sociopathic escalation, my heart would have stopped again. "I see," I said simply. "May I make a phone call to my attorney before you put those cuffs on?" "You have the right to legal counsel, ma'am," the detective said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "But the cuffs go on now. Turn around, please." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I turned around, placed my hands behind my back, and felt the cold, heavy bite of the steel lock around my wrists. As they marched me out of the building and into the back of a damp police cruiser, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, surgical focus. The trap was baited. The prey had stepped directly into the center. By the time I was processed and placed in a gray, windowless interrogation room at the precinct, Marianne had already arrived. She didn't look like a daughter worried about her elderly mother. She looked like an apex predator who had just smelled blood in the water. She was wearing a charcoal pinstripe suit, her briefcase resting on the metal table between us. "Are you okay, Mom?" she whispered, leaning across the table. "My wrists ache, but my chest is fine," I replied calmly. "Tell me exactly what she did." Marianne opened her briefcase. "Danielle called 911 at 2:15 p.m. today. She claimed you used an old hidden key to break into the Elmwood house while Robert was at work. She told the dispatcher you cornered her at the top of the stairs, screamed that you were going to kill her bastard child, and pushed her down a half-flight of steps." I let out a slow, breathy chuckle. It was so perfectly, absurdly dramatic. "And the baby?" "She was transported to Chicago General by ambulance," Marianne said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "She put on an Oscar-worthy performance in the ER, claimed severe cramping and bleeding. Because she's the victim of an assault, the police took her statement right there. They charged you immediately based on her testimony and the bruising she sustained from the fall." "She bruised herself," I noted. "Obviously," Marianne Saz said. "She wants to lock you in a cell, secure a permanent restraining order, and sue you in civil court for emotional distress and the loss of her child, forcing you to sign over the house as a settlement. It's a textbook extortion play." The heavy metal door of the interrogation room clicked open. The detective from my apartment walked in, accompanied by an assistant district attorney, ADA, a young, sharp-looking woman carrying a thick file. "Mrs. Hayes, counselor," the detective said, taking a seat across from us. "We're ready to take your statement. Though given the severity of the victim's injuries and the loss of the pregnancy, the ADA is prepared to offer a plea deal to avoid taking an elderly woman to trial." Marianne didn't even look at the plea paperwork. She folded her hands over her briefcase. "Detective," Marianne began, her voice smooth and coated in razor blades, "my client will not be taking a plea. In fact, my client will not be answering any questions regarding this fabricated assault. Instead, I would like to invite the victim and her husband into this room." The ADA frowned, looking offended. "Counselor, that is highly irregular and completely inappropriate. The victim is currently in the lobby filing the final restraining order paperwork with her husband. She just lost a child. We are not going to subject her to her abuser." You will subject her to us, Marianne said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Because if you don't, by 9 a.m. tomorrow, I will file a massive civil rights lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and elder abuse. I have exculpatory evidence that not only proves my client is innocent, but proves your victim has just committed a Class 4 felony in your jurisdiction. Bring them in ADA. Or you can explain to the press why you locked up a 65-year-old black widow with a heart condition based on the perjury of a known scammer. The detective and the ADA exchanged a tense, uncertain look. Marianne's confidence was a physical force in the room. Give me 5 minutes, the detective muttered, standing up and leaving the room. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Robert walked in first. He looked like a corpse. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollow and rimmed with red. He was practically carrying Danielle, supporting her weight against his side. Danielle was seated in a borrowed precinct wheelchair, a blanket draped dramatically over her lap. She was weeping, her face buried in her hands. When Robert saw me sitting at the metal table in handcuffs, a spasm of pure, unadulterated revulsion crossed his face. "You monster," he breathed, his voice cracking. "You killed my baby. You killed my child over a house." I looked at my son. The pain in his eyes was real. The grief was real. And my heart shattered for him, because I knew the cure I was about to administer was going to hurt far worse than the disease. "Sit down, Robert," Marianne ordered, pulling out 2 chairs on the opposite side of the table. Robert glared at her. "I'm not sitting. I want her locked up, Marianne. How can you defend her? She threw my wife down the stairs." "Robert, please," Danielle whimpered from the wheelchair, clutching his hand with white-knuckled desperation. "Take me home. I can't be near her. She's going to hurt me again. My baby. Bobby. Our baby." The ADA stepped forward. "Counselor, this is traumatic. Present your evidence immediately, or I am removing the victim." "Very well," Marianne said. She unclasped her briefcase. "Danielle, for the official police record with the ADA present, you are claiming that Scarlett Hayes broke into your home at 2:15 p.m. today and physically pushed you down the stairs. Is that correct?" Danielle sniffled, peeking out from behind her hands. She looked at the handcuffs on my wrists, mistaking them for victory. "Yes," she sobbed. "She pushed me. She said I was trash." "Thank you for cementing your perjury on the record," Marianne said cheerfully. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sleek black iPad. She laid it flat on the metal table, turning the screen to face the ADA, the detective, and Robert. "When my mother was exiled to a freezing utility shed and robbed of $58,000, we realized we were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual," Marianne addressed the room. "So, before my mother vacated the property to recover from the heart attack your wife induced, we hired a private security firm. They legally installed 4 pinhole motion-activated cameras in the common areas of the Elmwood house, the house my mother owns 100%. Danielle's weeping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so sudden, so profound, it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Robert blinked, staring at the blank screen of the iPad. "Cameras?" Marianne tapped the screen. A high-definition, full-color video began to play. It was a wide-angle shot of the Elmwood House staircase and the front foyer. The timestamp in the corner read, "Today, 2:10 p.m." On the screen, Danielle was completely alone. She wasn't weeping. She was pacing at the top of the stairs, looking furiously at her phone. She was wearing the exact same clothes she had on now. "Stupid bitch!" Danielle's voice hissed from the iPad speakers, the audio crystal clear. "Let's see her fight a felony." The people in the interrogation room watched in paralyzed fascination as the digital Danielle walked into the bathroom and returned holding a small plastic bottle. She squirted a dark red liquid, fake blood, onto the crotch of her sweatpants and smeared it onto her hands. Robert let out a sound. It wasn't a word. It was a low, strangled gasp, like a man who had just been stabbed in the lungs. He grabbed the edge of the metal table, his knuckles turning stark white. On the screen, Danielle carefully walked halfway down the stairs. She stopped, checked her phone one more time, and then deliberately knocked a heavy ceramic vase off a side table. It shattered loudly. Then she laid down on the landing, pulled out her phone, and dialed 911. "Help, please help me," her recorded voice wailed, identical to the performance she had just given in the precinct. "My mother-in-law broke in. She pushed me. I'm pregnant, please, my baby." Marianne tapped the screen, pausing the video right on Danielle's face, a face twisted in a fake sociopathic mask of agony. The interrogation room was dead silent. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Robert slowly, mechanically, turned his head to look at his wife. The woman in the wheelchair. The woman who was supposed to be mourning the violent death of their unborn child. Danielle was frozen. The blanket had slipped off her lap. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically between the iPad, the detective, and Robert. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. "Bobby," she whispered, her voice trembling, stripping away the victim act and replacing it with pure panic. "Bobby, it's not... They manipulated the video. It's AI. It's a fake video to frame me." "Shut up," Robert said. His voice was so quiet, so devoid of emotion, it was terrifying. "But we aren't done," Marianne said, striking the final fatal blow. She pulled the official medical document from her briefcase and slid it directly in front of Robert. "You can fake a video, Danielle, but you cannot fake a subpoenaed 5-year-old medical record." Robert looked down at the paper. His eyes tracked the highlighted lines. Total laparoscopic hysterectomy. He read it. He read it again. The cognitive dissonance was so massive, his brain seemed to short-circuit. He looked up at Marianne, his eyes pleading for it to be a nightmare, a sick joke. "She doesn't have a uterus, Robert," Marianne said, her voice finally softening with a trace of sisterly pity. "She can't have children. There was no baby. There was never a baby. It was a prop used to trap you, to drain Mom's bank account to pay off her massive debts, and to steal the house. The trauma bond didn't just break. It shattered into a million jagged pieces, tearing through Robert's psyche. He realized in one blinding flash of agony the magnitude of what he had done. He had called his mother a murderer. He had abandoned her while she had a heart attack. He had stolen her life savings. He had destroyed his entire family for an illusion, for a predator. Robert stumbled backward, knocking his chair to the floor. He scrambled away from Danielle's wheelchair as if she were radiating toxic waste. "Don't," he choked out, holding his hands up to his head, pulling at his own hair. "Don't look at me. Don't speak to me. You... He couldn't find a word vile enough. He turned his back to her, pressing his face into the cinder-block wall of the interrogation room, and began to sob, deep, racking, guttural sobs that shook his entire body. Danielle looked around the room, realizing she was completely cornered. The illusion was dead. She turned to the ADA. "I want a lawyer," she demanded, her voice suddenly harsh, abrasive, and entirely sane. The ADA looked at her with an expression of pure disgust. She turned to the detective. "Detective, uncuff Mrs. Hayes immediately. All charges against her are dropped." The detective walked behind me. The heavy click of the lock disengaging echoed in the room. The steel cuffs fell away, and the blood rushed back into my hands. I rubbed my wrists slowly, maintaining my dignity. "As for you," the ADA said, turning her sharp gaze onto Danielle. "Detective, place Mrs. Vance under arrest for filing a false police report, perjury, and attempted extortion. We will also be reviewing the financial wire transfers regarding the $58,000 for potential felony wire fraud." "Stand up," the detective ordered Danielle, pulling the cuffs he had just taken off me. "I'm not standing. I'm in a wheelchair," Danielle shrieked, thrashing her arms. "We saw the video," the detective deadpanned. "Stand up or I'll drag you up." As the detective pulled a screaming, cursing Danielle out of the wheelchair and slammed her hands behind her back, I didn't look at her. She was irrelevant now. A parasite that had been successfully excised. I looked at my son, who was still slumped against the wall, weeping for a child that never existed, and weeping for the mother he had betrayed. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer. I walked over to Robert. I didn't hug him. He hadn't earned that yet. But I placed a single warm hand on his shaking shoulder. "The truth is out, Robert," I said quietly over the sound of his sobbing. "Now you have to decide what kind of man is going to walk out of this room." I turned and walked out of the interrogation room, the heavy metal door closing behind me, leaving the wreckage of Danielle's lies locked safely inside. The fallout from the interrogation room was swift and absolute. Robert did not return to the house on Elmwood Drive that night. He went back, packed 2 suitcases of his clothes while a police escort waited by the door, and checked himself into a cheap motel out by the interstate. He filed for divorce the very next morning, citing extreme cruelty and fraud. Danielle, however, was a cockroach. She was resilient in the face of her own toxicity. After spending 3 nights in county lockup, she managed to secure a shady bail bondsman by using a vehicle title that we later found out didn't even belong to her. She was released pending trial for perjury, filing a false police report, and the looming financial investigation regarding my $58,000. For the first few weeks, I stayed in the Oak Park apartment. I needed the neutral ground to let my heart physically heal. Mary Ann's legal team descended on the Elmwood house with a biohazard cleaning crew and a locksmith, ensuring Danielle could never cross the threshold again. I thought we were simply waiting for the slow wheels of the justice system to crush Danielle at trial. But predators, when they are starved and desperate, make sloppy mistakes. 3 months after the arrest, Mary Ann stopped by my apartment on a Friday evening. She brought a bottle of expensive Cabernet, 2 glasses, and a smile so sharp it could have cut glass. "Pour us a glass, Mom," Mary Ann said, kicking off her heels and sinking into the beige sofa. "You are going to want to toast to this." I poured the wine, handed her a glass, and sat in my armchair. What happened? Did the ADA finally formally charge her for the wire fraud? "Oh, the ADA doesn't have to worry about the wire fraud anymore," Mary Ann said, taking a sip and savoring the taste. "Because the FBI just took over Danielle's entire existence." I raised an eyebrow. "The FBI? Federal?" Mary Ann let out a rich, genuine laugh. "Danielle was broke. Her credit is destroyed, her husband abandoned her, and her criminal defense lawyer demanded a massive retainer. She needed a huge infusion of cash, fast. So what does a parasite do when it's detached from its host? It goes hunting for a new one." Mary Ann set her glass down and leaned forward, her eyes dancing with the thrill of the legal kill. She got on an exclusive, high-end dating app for wealthy professionals. She matched with a man named Arthur, 55 years old, divorced, very wealthy, and frequently travels out of state for work. Danielle spun her web perfectly. She played the tragic, vulnerable younger woman. They dated for barely 6 weeks before she pulled her signature move. I felt a sickening sense of déjà vu. "Don't tell me." She told him she was pregnant. "Like clockwork," Mary Ann confirmed. But Arthur wasn't Robert. Arthur didn't want a new family. He panicked, and Danielle, smelling the panic, pivoted to pure extortion. She told Arthur that she was morally opposed to abortion, but her medical condition meant the pregnancy was extremely high risk. She demanded $25,000 for specialized out-of-state medical care and threatened that if he didn't wire the money, she would publicly name him, ruin his reputation, and drag him through a brutal paternity suit. "She's a monster," I whispered. "Did he pay it?" "He almost did," Mary Ann smiled, leaning back. "But Arthur is a smart businessman. Before he wired $25,000 to a woman he barely knew, he called his corporate legal counsel for advice on how to draft a non-disclosure agreement regarding the payment." Mary Ann paused, letting the suspense hang in the quiet apartment. "Mom, Arthur's last name is Pendleton. He is the CEO of Pendleton Logistics. They are one of the top-tier corporate clients at my law firm. He called my managing partner." I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth as the sheer cosmic irony of the situation hit me. When my boss heard the name Danielle Vance demanding wire transfers for a miracle pregnancy, he walked straight down the hall to my office. Mary Ann continued, her grin predatory. I took one look at Arthur's file and immediately contacted the authorities. Because Danielle demanded the money be wired across state lines to an offshore account she had somehow secured, it upgraded the crime from local extortion to federal wire fraud. We set a trap. "You set a trap?" "The FBI set the trap. We just provided the bait," Mary Ann corrected. Arthur agreed to meet her at a high-end coffee shop in the Loop to supposedly hand over the signed NDA and initiate the wire transfer on his laptop. As soon as Danielle hit confirm on the transfer, effectively completing the cybercrime, 4 plainclothes federal agents stood up from the surrounding tables. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. They arrested her. They didn't just arrest her. They seized her phone, which had all the texts proving the extortion. And because she committed a federal felony while out on bail for state charges, her bail was immediately revoked. She is sitting in this Metropolitan Correctional Center right now, Mom. No bail, no escape. The federal prosecutor is looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in federal prison. She is gone. I looked down at my glass of wine. The dark red liquid caught the light of the setting sun. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the urge to cheer. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of relief. The heavy, suffocating blanket of anxiety that had draped over my shoulders for the last year was finally lifted. The threat was neutralized. Not by my anger, but by the natural, inevitable consequences of Danielle's own arrogance. "Cheers," I said softly, clinking my glass against Mary Ann's. "Cheers, Mom," she replied. "Now it's time for you to go home." 6 months after Danielle was locked away, I stood in the hallway of my home on Elmwood Drive. The house smelled of lemon pledge, fresh lilies, and baking bread. It had taken a month of deep cleaning to scrub the lingering scent of Danielle's cheap floral air fresheners from the walls. The guest room, the room she had demanded be painted Swiss coffee white for a phantom nursery, was now a vibrant, warm terracotta. I had turned it into a reading room, filling it with plush armchairs, my husband's restored vinyl collection, and a wall of bookshelves. The utility shed at the backyard was just a shed again. I had hired a crew to haul the folding cot to the dump, power wash the concrete, and fill it with bags of potting soil, gardening tools, and terracotta pots. I had reclaimed my space inch by inch, memory by memory. It was a Sunday afternoon. At exactly 1 p.m., the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked to the front door, and opened it. Robert stood on the porch. He was wearing a simple sweater and jeans. He looked vastly different from the shattered, weeping man in the interrogation room, and different still from the exhausted, haunted man who had lived here under Danielle's thumb. He had put some healthy weight back on. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded humility. In his hands, he held a bouquet of yellow tulips in a white bakery box. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice soft, lacking any of the defensive edge it used to carry. "Hello, Robert. Come in." I stepped aside. He walked in, taking off his shoes at the door, respectful of the space in a way he hadn't been in years. We moved to the kitchen. I put the tulips in a vase while he plated the pastries he had brought. For the first few months after the arrest, Robert and I had not spoken. My cardiologist and my therapist had both agreed that I needed absolute distance to heal my heart, both physically and emotionally. I needed Robert to figure out who he was without a woman manipulating his every thought, and I needed to figure out who I was when I wasn't sacrificing myself for my children. When he finally reached out, it wasn't with demands or dramatic pleas. It was a handwritten letter, mailed to the house. He told me he had started intense psychological therapy, twice a week. He was working through his codependency, his need to please, and the trauma bond that had blinded him. He had rented a small, one-bedroom studio apartment near his office. He was living within his means, paying his own bills, and slowly untangling the financial mess Danielle had left behind. We started with 5-minute phone calls, then coffee at a public diner. Today was the first time he had stepped foot inside the Elmwood house since the day he packed his bags. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the heart attack had happened. But today the surface was clean, warmed by the afternoon sun. "The house looks beautiful, Mom," Robert said, looking around. "It feels lighter. It feels like you." "It takes work to keep the rot out," I replied honestly, sipping my tea. "But the foundation is strong." Robert nodded slowly. He set his teacup down and folded his hands on the table. "Mom, I've spent the last 6 months talking to my therapist about fear, about why I let her do what she did, why I let myself do what I did to you." I stayed silent, letting him speak. I didn't rescue him from the discomfort. "When Dad died, I was so young," Robert continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I watched you work yourself to the bone, double shifts at the hospital, coming home with swollen ankles, just to make sure Mary Ann, George, and I had everything. I internalized this massive debt. I felt like I had to prove to you that your sacrifice wasn't a waste. I thought the only way to do that was to have the perfect life. The perfect wife, the perfect house, the perfect family." He looked down at his hands. "When Danielle started manufacturing crises, when the debt collectors called, I panicked. I felt like I was failing the image of the man I was supposed to be. She weaponized my desire to be a protector, but my therapist helped me realize something horrifying. In my desperation to protect the illusion of my perfect family, I sacrificed the only real family I had. I sacrificed you." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. He didn't look away this time. I was a coward. I stole your security. I allowed you to be treated like an animal in your own home, and I blamed you when my own lie started to crush me. There is no apology big enough in the English language for that, Mom, but I am so profoundly sorry. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of validation. For a year, I had been told I was crazy, difficult, and toxic. Hearing the truth spoken aloud, taking accountability, was the medicine my soul needed. I forgive you, Robert, I said quietly. His breath hitched. You do? I do. As a mother, I will always love you. And as a woman, I forgive you because holding on to the anger is drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I refuse to carry Danielle's poison in my veins anymore. I reached across the table and covered his hands with mine. But Robert, you need to understand something. Forgiveness does not mean amnesia. The door is open for you to be in my life, but the locks have been changed. Trust is a house built brick by brick. You knocked it down. Now you have to do the work to rebuild it. I know, he said, nodding vigorously, wiping a tear from his cheek. I expect to. I want to earn it. He reached into this pocket of his sweater and pulled out a thick legal envelope. He slid it across the table toward me. What is this? I asked. It's the final deed to the house and the notarized legal filings, Robert explained. Marianne's office helped me draft it. It formally revokes any tenancy at will claims I could ever make and waives any right to the property in the event of a dispute. It also includes a legally binding promissory note. I set up an auto draft from my payroll. Every month, $2,000 will be deposited directly into your high-yield savings account until the $58,000 plus 5% interest is completely repaid. I looked at the envelope. He wasn't just giving me words. He was giving me actionable, legally binding restitution. He was finally acting like a man. You don't have to live in a tiny studio, Robert, I said softly. You can afford a better place if you aren't paying me $2,000 a month. I don't deserve a better place right now, he said firmly. I need to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet without using yours as a crutch. Keep the paperwork, Mom. It's yours. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking. Not about the past, but about his work, about Marianne's upcoming trial, about George's new baby in Texas. It wasn't perfect. There was still a fragile, careful tension between us, the way one walks softly on a newly healed bone. But it was real, and real was infinitely better than perfect. When evening came, Robert hugged me goodbye at the door. It was a tight, lingering hug. I love you, Mom, he said. I love you too, son. Drive safe. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and smiled. I made myself a glass of iced sweet tea, heavy on the lemon, and walked out the back door. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the Chicago sky in brilliant streaks of violet and gold. I walked past the utility shed without a second glance. I sat down in the padded wicker chair on my back porch. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of the jasmine bushes I had planted along the fence line. I took a sip of my sweet tea and leaned back, resting my head against the cushion. A year ago, I had sat shivering in that shed, wondering if my life was over, wondering if my usefulness had expired, if my destiny was simply to be erased by the greed and cowardice of youth. But I had learned something in the fire. I learned that my grace is not a weakness. My patience is not an invitation for abuse. And my love, while deep and enduring, is not unconditional when it requires the sacrifice of my own dignity. I looked at the house around me, the solid brick walls, the glowing windows. It was quiet. It was safe. We did all right, Marcus, I whispered to the evening breeze, thinking of my brother, my husband, and the ancestors who had fought for the right just to own a piece of this earth. I am Scarlett Hayes. I am 65 years old. I am a mother, a widow, a retired nurse, and a survivor. And as I sat on my porch, watching the stars begin to prick through the twilight, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This is my kingdom, and no one will ever dethrone me again.